Real quick before I put this up, I guess somebody messed with my camera settings and now the camera quality is not the greatest, but the information is still good, so I'm going to put this video up. I got a couple of videos like this, but like I said, the information's still good, so I think I'm going to put it up anyway. Hello there, people of the internet. I've made a lot of top 5 videos in my time, but I don't think I've ever made a top 5 best handguns. We're not talking about favorites, we're not talking about anything opinion based, but the top 5 best handguns just in general. If we observe their influence on history and their capabilities for the time periods where they came out at, I think that I have found legitimately the top 5 best handguns out there ever of all time. So let's go ahead and start off. We're going to start off with the earliest one here. This isn't necessarily this particular handgun. More or less it's going to be this genre of handgun. And I would probably have to give that to your cap and ball revolvers. So back whenever Colt, technically he made the Pedersen revolver, but that was light and wimpy and it didn't really work out for him. So we're going to start off at the Colt Walker. Back whenever Colt made the Colt Walker series for, I believe, the Texas Rangers, it was a revolutionary handgun for the time period because by a pretty gosh darn huge margin, most of the handguns that most people were using were still the old school single shot muzzle loading handguns where you had to pour gunpowder down a barrel and use a ramrod to ram it home and whatnot. Well, back whenever Colt ended up coming out with I think it was 1848 where he came out with those Walker revolvers, that really showcased what a revolver could be, and the popularity of that really started to take off. The Pedersen revolvers, like I said, they did exist, and they actually inspired the Colt revolver, or the Colt Walker. Well, then after that, a few years later, 1851, Colt saw that people needed a revolver that wasn't so big and powerful, and so he came up with the 1851 pattern. After that, 1860 pattern, and then the U.S. Civil War happened, and those revolvers were stupidly popular. Remington had their own black powder muzzle-loading revolvers that they were using. It was all kind of a mishmash of all sorts of different guns. But until the revolver came along, all of the handguns that everybody was using was just single-shot muzzle-loading handguns. And with something like this right here, you now had a means to be able to have multiple cylinders loaded and fire 6 shots before you had to actually reload your handgun. You take your... Most of the time, people would be pouring just like loose powder and whatnot. But there were paper cartridges that did exist, but for all intents and purposes, you take your loose powder, you charge it out, your measurement, whatever it is that you decide to charge your load with. That doesn't sound right. Pour it into your chamber, stick a ball on top, and then you use a built-in ramrod to ram that ball home, just like that, and that seats it down. Put a percussion cap on back of your cylinder, and now you have yourself 6 shots, which was revolutionary for the time period where these came out. If you had 6 shots in your revolver before you had to reload and you were going up, just think about that. One man had the firepower of 6 men at the time period where these things were starting to pop up, which was absolutely revolutionary and game-changing for the time period. If you had a belt of, say, 6 revolvers on you, you were a god. You were basically a god at that particular time. So just because of the increase in capabilities with that particular style of handgun, I think that very solidly deserves to be on the list. Alright, up next on the list, this one's going to be a little controversial. I chose to go with a Smith & Wesson top rake revolver simply because this right here, with its capabilities, I think would outclass the 1873 Colt, the single-action army that people are so infatuated with and that they absolutely drool over. During that time period, if you had somebody with a single-action army and somebody with, say, a Schofield, the man with the Schofield would easily be able to outperform the man with the single-action army just because of reload speed. With something like this right here, you don't need to deal with loading gate and ejection rod and single loading the thing like you would with a single action army. All you would have to do is break open the top of the revolver and all of your rounds get ejected from this automatic ejector. All your spent shells go flying off, and then you start loading your rounds. I'm not sure what year Smith & Wesson actually came up with their, well, with any sort of moon clip or speed loader or anything like that, but I imagine if you had some sort of setup to where you could speed load your things, then you would be significantly faster. I think that your top break Smith & Wesson revolvers outclass your 1873s just in reload time alone. The 1873s are, of course, more popular than your Smith & Wesson top breaks, just because they were adopted by the U.S. military and have a massive, massive following behind them. But I legitimately do think that these old school Smith & Wesson break open revolvers do outclass those. So I would have to give it to these right here. These right here, I think, for the time period where cartridge revolver technology was extraordinarily predominant in the United States, I think that these reign supreme by a pretty huge margin. Alright, up next would not be a list like this if I did not include the 1911. So back whenever the United States military was using .38 caliber revolvers, specifically in, I believe, the Philippines, they were having difficulties putting down natives. Their revolvers just weren't powerful enough, and so they ended up adopting .45 ACP in a semi-auto self-loading handgun, and that is what the 1911 is. The 1911 saw its way through, of course, 2 world wars, along with Korea, Vietnam, and it's actually still in mild use today in the United States and in several other militaries all around the world. .45 ACP, that's a 230 grain bullet if we're just talking about standard ball ammunition, which is a pretty gosh darn heavy honking round. To put that into perspective, into ball 30-06, like the military's 30-06, that's a 150 grain bullet, so that's 80 grains of bullet heavier in your pistol. Now, granted, those bullets are only moving from this barrel length probably about 800 feet per second. From a longer barrel length, you might get 850 feet per second from, like, say, a Thompson barrel or something like that. But that heavy bullet moving at 800 feet per second, that's still quite a bit of energy going downrange. As a matter of fact, just shy of using a Magnum cartridge or something like that, I would say that your .45 ACP, if we're talking about just standard ball ammunition, is probably going to be your most powerful semi-auto handgun cartridge that you can use until you bump up into Magnum territory. Now, if we start looking at more modern options, like, say, 10mm or something like that, then, of course, we're going to see a lot of discrepancies and whatnot, but .45 ACP is definitely up there. With the amount of history and the amount of what's the word I'm looking for, inspiration from not only firearms design in the United States, but just firearms culture in the United States that came from the 1911 as a whole. It's awe-inspiring just how much of an influence this one single handgun design has had on the firearms industry all around the world, let alone in the United States. So this right here, very literally, well, it's very literally my favorite style of handgun, but it very literally might be one of the best little handguns that the world has ever seen. Every single other handgun that we've seen out there pales in comparison in the ratio to the amount of time that it had to shine. There isn't anything else from that time period that could still stack up to today's standards besides maybe the high power. But that's an argument for another time. The high power still had that Browning tilting barrel action. It still had that same delay mechanism system. But I think just because here in the United States, because of how iconic the 1911 is, I would have to give it the title of best over the Browning high power. Alright, up next, I'd probably have to give it to the Beretta 92 series of handguns. These right here were adopted by the United States military. They actually are what replaced the 1911. They're a double stack 9mm. They don't do anything particularly well, but in comparison to the capacity limitations that the 1911 had, this right here was a significant game changer and a significant step up to the capabilities of the average soldier. Not only that, but there are all sorts of different handguns out there inspired by the design and the locking mechanism that the Beretta 92S has. If we start looking at other features that this handgun offers in comparison to, say, a 1911, we have a decocker. We have a different style of safety that is easier to use and more difficult to get, what's the word I'm looking for? More difficult to engage with your thumb upon firing, which I have done on several occasions with the 1911. Having your safety up on your slide it's more difficult to hit that with your thumb. On top of that, on the Beretta itself, we have this massive open ejection port, and this right here is one of the reasons why these styles of handguns are so extraordinarily reliable, because there's nothing there for a brass casing to get caught on as it ejects out of the system. Like, the entire ejection port there is cut open, like you have 180 degrees of full view. On top of all of that, this right here has actual locking lugs on it, unlike a delayed blowback system, which technically this right here is. There are other guns out there, say like, I don't know, there's a couple of straight blowback systems like the Makarov. The Makarov has some pretty gosh darn significant limitations with what it is able to use because it is a straight blowback design. Unlike something that has a locking system in it, and I get that it's still a delayed blowback system, but the locking system holds the chamber closed until pressures inside of the barrel have died down, and then the recoil from the firearm actually unlocks the system, as opposed to like gas pressure or something like that. But guns like your 92S or your 1911 or handguns that have a locking system on them of some kind or some sort of delaying system of some kind, you can handle more powerful ammunition in comparison to a straight blowback design like, say, a Makarov system. What you could do to delay it is kind of do what High Point did and get like a really heavy slide to slap onto your guns, so it takes a lot of time for that slide to open up, but that's not a good solution. High Points are ugly and they're heavy and they're cumbersome and they're just not all that great of a design. But I think just because of the benefits that you get from the Beretta 92S models in comparison to what you were used to before that with your 1911s, I think this right here was a huge step up in terms of what the United States military was dealing with. Alright, last but not least, this would not be a complete list if I did not include Glock. Now this right here, I don't actually own a Glock because I don't care about Glock, but I would be stupid if I did not include them into this list. Glock pioneered the way for polymer frame handguns. Nowadays, basically all of your modern self-defense style handguns are going to be a polymer frame, and there's a reason for that. The polymer frames are strong enough and adequate enough to be able to sustain themselves upon firing. They are strong enough and adequate enough to not fall apart under normal use, and they're capable enough to withstand what most people would need a handgun to be able to withstand. On top of that, they're extraordinarily easy to make, unlike, say, a milled receiver where you need to cut out all of the little things inside of your receiver in order to form your receiver from like just a straight block of metal. Polymer frame, most of the time they're literally just cast. They're cast polymer, and that's good enough and adequate enough to be able to make a good handgun frame because there's no pressures there. There's no real significant wearing forces on the frame of your handgun receiver. All of the pressures, all of the everything is contained in the barrel and the breech. All of the force of the recoil and whatnot is all transferred into the slide for the most part. And what is transferred into the frame is well within the capabilities of the frame to be able to handle. So on top of having a cheap, easy to make frame for your handgun, it's also extraordinarily lightweight. We live in an era, thanks to Glock with their pioneering of the polymer frame technology, we live in an era where we can have extraordinarily capable handguns for not a lot of weight. Like for example, this right here, this is a 40 Smith & Wesson, and it holds 14 rounds of ammunition. Combine the ammunition with a good brand and a good bullet type, like this right here is Hornady defensive ammunition. If I have this right here, and I have my 14 rounds of 40 Smith & Wesson, this is still significantly lighter weight than my 1911 with 45 ACP, and this is unloaded. This right here is an all-steel handgun versus the polymer frame. This is lighter weight. This is going to be significantly easier to carry around, and I have more capacity and more capability, and Glock was the ones who pioneered that technology. Nowadays, basically all of your self-defense handguns that you're going to be finding for practical purposes are Glock clones of some kind. They're all Glock inspired. They all have the same general principles and mechanical designs that a Glock has, and that's because Glock does it extraordinarily good. If you're not looking for a handgun for collectability purposes or for cool factor or for any reason other than to be a practical tool to be able to do a job, then you get a Glock or a Glock clone. Either that or you go out and you get yourself a Beretta 92. This right here is another really popular one that I've seen out there. But I think by a pretty huge margin, you're getting some sort of polymer frame handgun that is inspired by the Glock build. And because of the massive pioneering work that Glock has done to reach that point to where basically everything modern is designed off of their work, they absolutely need to be on this list. I don't like them. I don't own them. But to deny them the lineage of being extraordinarily successful is just stupid. So, thanks for watching, folks. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.